Hola y bienvenidos a este video sobre el presente en español. Hello and welcome to this video lesson where we're going to start exploring the regular Spanish present tense. Los retos de esta clase son aprender qué es el presente y cuándo se usa, aprender los tres grupos de terminaciones diferentes para el presente y empezar a utilizar algunos verbos diferentes en el presente. Vamos. La primera pregunta que vamos a mirar es ¿qué es el presente? So the first question we're going to take a look at is what is the present tense? The present tense is used in the same way to how we use it in English, to talk about actions, events and ideas happening in the present. So things like I study Spanish or I learn Spanish. We could say I am learning Spanish, that's called the present continuous. So two ways of talking about the present in English. And also to talk about things that normally happen or that we normally do. So they don't need to take place right now. If we use words like normally, or in Spanish, normalmente. For example, I could say, normally in the summer I go to the beach. That doesn't mean I'm going to the beach right now or that it's summer right now. But when we use the word normally or normalmente, we use the present tense. And that's the same in both English and Spanish. La próxima pregunta que vamos a mirar es cómo se usa el presente. So the next question we're going to take a look at is how is the present tense used? Now to start using the present tense in Spanish, there are two things you need to know. What an infinitive verb is and what the three types of verbs are in Spanish. And I'm going to tell you those things right now. So an infinitive is a verb that is in its neutral form. In English, an infinitive is to and then the verb itself. For example, to do, to be, to swim, to eat, to dance, to play, to read, to write. These are all verbs in the infinitive form in English. So no one is doing the action. Now we can take an infinitive like to play and conjugate it, and that means make it so that someone is doing it. So to play becomes I play, or you play, or he plays. And then we can change the tense of that. It could be I played, I have played, I will play, I would play. These are all different tenses. So we can take an infinitive which is neutral, it's not in any tense, and it's not being done by anyone, and then we can put it into a tense and make it so that someone is doing it. Now the three types of verbs in Spanish, at least the three types of regular verbs, are verbs that end in AR, ER, or IR. So all of the hundreds, possibly even more than 1,000 regular verbs in Spanish, they all end in one of these three two-letter combinations, AR, ER, IR. And we'll see some examples of this in a couple of minutes' time. Now to explore these three different types of verb endings, these three different types of Spanish infinitive verbs, I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about three lots of verbs that go on holiday. So let's talk about las vacaciones de los verbos, verb vacation, or a holiday for verbs. Now imagine all of the Spanish verbs go on holiday to this beautiful seaside location. The AR verbs are going to stay in one hotel. The ER verbs are going to stay in a different one, more suited to their needs. And the IR verbs are going to stay in a third hotel. Now there is a small group of irregular verbs that are going to stay at that hotel all the way at the end of the beach, but we're not going to look at that hotel today. We're just going to focus on the regular ones. So the AR, ER and IR verbs. So this is the first hotel that we come across on that beach. It's called Hotel Conjugation. It's a chain of hotels, and it's going to be the same one we're going to see for the AR verbs, the ERs and the IRs. We can see above the door this one says AR verbs welcome, so we're in the right place if we want to conjugate an AR verb. We can also see that it says no infinitives allowed. Please leave your endings at the door. So as I mentioned, all of those regular verbs in Spanish end in AR, ER or IR, but we need to take those endings off in order to conjugate into the present tense. Now to conjugate a verb, we need to make it so that someone's doing it. So if we take a verb in English, like the verb to play isn't in any tense and no one's doing the action, it's neutral. But if we want to put that into the English present tense, we could say I play, you play, he, she, it, or singular they play. Now the singular they is what non-binary people use. we play, you all play, they play. So in this hotel, the verb is going to organise itself so that all the single people are staying in the rooms on the left, and all of the couples, all of the family groups where there's more than one person, they're all going to stay on the right-hand side. So we've got I, that's a singular person, you, a singular person, he, she, it, and they, that's a singular person, and they're what we call the first person singular, the second person singular, and the third person singular. So I is in the first person, you is in the second person, and so on. And then on the right-hand side, we've got all the kind of persons, grammatical persons, where there's more than one. So we need more than one person to make we, you all, and they. And we is the first person plural, you all is the second person plural, and they is the third person plural. Now in Spanish, these pronouns are yo, tú, él, ella or ella, he, she or singular they, nosotros, we, which can become nosotras and nosotres as well, vosotros, vosotras or vosotres, and ellos, ellas or ellas. But Spanish is what's called a pro-drop language. You can actually drop those pronouns. You don't need them, and the reason is in English, with the verb to play, it stays the same all the way through. So I play, you play, he plays, it just gets an S on the end. So without the pronouns, we don't know who's doing the action. But Spanish is really clever because all of the 6 versions of the word, of the verb, they have different endings, so that just with one word, we know what that action is, when it's happening, and who is doing it. So it's really efficient. And our endings for AR verbs are o, as, a, amos, ais, an. So we can take a verb, take off the ending, take it into the hotel, and then add these endings so that different people can do the action in the present tense. And we'll have a look at this in context with the verb in just a moment. So now let's take a look at this with a verb to actually make it make a bit more sense. So in this hotel, this AR Verb Hotel, today's chef special is the verb hablar. Hablar means to speak or to talk. Now we know we need to leave our verb ending at the door. There's no infinitives allowed in the hotel. So we get rid of that AR and then we add our o, as, a, amos, ais, an. Now practice repeating those after me because it's a really good way to remember them. O, as, a, amos, ais, an. So when we take our stem, which is hablar without the AR, so hablo, we can then add the O and we get hablo. So we could say yo hablo, I speak, but we don't actually need that yo. We could just say hablo, and that means I speak in Spanish. Hablo español, I speak Spanish. Hablo inglés, I speak English. No hablo español, I don't speak Spanish. So it's quite easy to actually start using these verbs in the present tense. Now if we get our verb stem, H-A-B-L, and we add as, the second ending, we get hablas. Tú hablas español. You speak Spanish. Or we can get rid of the two and just say hablas español. We can ask it's a question. ¿Hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? ¿Hablas inglés? Do you speak English? We do the same with the a endings. We've got o, as, a. So we've got hablo, hablas, habla. Hablamos, we speak. Habláis, you all speak. Hablan, they speak. Now, to help you remember these steps that we have to go through to put verbs into the present tense, we can add a bit more detail into our story about this verb vacation. So imagine you're an AR verb, you get to the hotel, you've got to leave your AR at the door. But then these different endings we can add, the present tense endings for AR verbs, we can think of them almost like those robes or those dressing gowns you get in posh hotels. So you have to leave the AR at the door, but then when you get to your room you can put on one of these posh robes. And depending on who's going to do the verb, it could be o as a, and that's what you get in the single rooms, amos, ais, an, and they're the ones you get to choose from in the family or the couple rooms. If you find that doesn't help you remember it, then forget all about it, because language learning is a really personal experience and different things help different people. So the important thing is finding what works for you. Now let's go through that process again using another AR verb. So now we're going to take a look at the verb estudiar, which means to study. Now that's what's called a near cognate because it looks and sounds very much like the word in English. It's quite common for words that start with ST or SP in English to have an E at the beginning in Spanish, like study, estudiar, station, estación, Spanish, español, Spain, España. There's lots of examples. So with the verb estudiar, again we know no infinitives are allowed in this hotel. We need to leave our AR ending at the door. So that leaves us with the verb stem, estudi. And then we can add our O as a, amos, ais, an. Estudio, I study. Estudias, you study. Estudia, he, she, it, or they study. Estudiamos, we study. Estudiais, you all study. And estudian, they study. Now, I know I said you can drop the pronoun in Spanish. Sometimes you might want to use it. For example, with estudia, just that word on its own, it doesn't necessarily tell us whether it means he studies, she studies, they study in the singular they, or it studies. It's unlikely to be it studies, to be fair. So when there's a bit of ambiguity, so when it's not 100% clear, you can add in él estudia, he studies, just to make things a bit clearer, but it's optional. Always in Spanish it's optional, whereas in English we have to use the pronouns 100% of the time. Now we'll take one last look at AR verbs with another example, which is the verb escuchar, to listen. So again, we leave our AR at the door, add an O, we get escucho, I listen. Escuchas, you listen. Escucha, he, she, it, they listen. Escuchamos, we listen. Escucháis, you all listen. Escuchan, they listen. For example, normalmente escucho música. Normally, I listen to music. So that gives us three verbs that we can use in the present tense, and not just in the I form, but in the you form, the he form, we, you plural, they. So we can say all sorts of different things using what we've learnt so far. And we're just beginning, because actually, though I said AR verbs are the most common, there are lots of other verbs that we can unlock by learning the ER endings and the IR endings. So let's take another look at our verb vacation, las vacaciones de los verbos. We've already visited the AR Verb Hotel, the most popular one on the beach, but next up we're going to go to the ER Verb Hotel. Now at first glance, this hotel looks very much like the AR Verb Hotel. We've got the same layout, we've got singles on the left, couples on the right, so all of the singular versions of the verb. I do the verb, you do the verb, he does the verb. That's all on the left, and then we've got couples on the right. We do the action, you all do the action, they do the action. But compared to the AR hotel, in this hotel, all of the A's are replaced with E's. So instead of O as a, amos, ais, an, we get O, that stays the same, es, instead of as, a, hemos, es, en. O es e, hemos es en. Practice saying that. O es e, hemos es en. Now we'll take a look with an actual verb like we did with the ARs. So in this hotel, today's chef special is the verb beber, which is the verb to drink. So again, we've got to leave the ending at the door because no infinitives are allowed inside the hotel. So we take off the ER and then we're just left with beb. That's what we call the verb stem. And then we add our o, es, e, hemos, es, en. So we get bebo, I drink, bebes, you drink, bebe, he, she, it, singular, they drink, bebemos, we drink, bebes, you all drink, beben, they drink. So nice and easy, we follow exactly the same steps that we did with the AR ones, where we take off the ending, get our verb stem, and then we're putting on those verb ending dressing gowns, if you like, but instead of o, as, a, amos, ais, an, all of those a's change to e's, and we get o, es, e, hemos, es, en. And this is what we can do with all of the regular ER verbs in Spanish, and there are lots of them. So now we're coming to the third destination on our little tour of this holiday resort. So we've seen the AR verbs in las vacaciones de los verbos. We've seen the ER verbs. Next up, and finally, we're going to have a look at the IR Verb Hotel. Now again, it looks just like the AR one, it looks just like the ER one, and there are actually only two differences from the one next door. So this hotel looks a lot like the ER Verb Hotel, and there are only two differences, and those differences are with the we form and the you all, the you plural form. The rest of the endings stay the same, so we have singles on the left again, couples on the right, o, es, a, exactly like the ER ones, and this is where the differences are. Instead of hemos with an E, we have imos, and instead of es, eis, we have is, is. And then the final one is exactly the same as it is for ER verbs, en. And now we'll take a look at this with a really useful IR verb. So in this hotel, today's chef special is the verb vivir. That is the verb to live. So we can use it to talk about living as in being alive, but also living as in I live in England, I live in a house. So we can use it to mean both kind of ways of living. So what we need to do is leave the IR at the door, because no infinitives are allowed in the hotel. That leaves us with the stem VIV, bib. So remember, V's in Spanish, they're pronounced a bit more like B's. So it's not vivir, but bibir, bibir. So we're left with VIV, and then we need to add our O, es, A, the same as with ER. So vivo, vives, vive. I live, you live, and then he, she, it, or they live. Then we go not to vivemos, because this is where it's slightly different. It goes to vivimos. Vivimos, we live. Vivimos en España. We live in Spain. Vivís, the other one that's different. Vivís en España. Do you live in Spain? Do you all live in Spain? And then finally, viven. Mis padres viven conmigo. My parents live with me. Vivo en una casa. I live in a house. So we can use these endings and this kind of these steps that we've taken with all of the regular IR verbs. And that brings us towards the end of the lesson, because now we've explored the three different types of verb endings. We know what an infinitive is. We know what we need to do with it to conjugate it in the hotel conjugation. So we leave the ending at the door and then we add one of these endings depending on who's doing the action. And now when you come across verbs in Spanish, even if you don't know what all the conjugations are, you could see a verb for the first time. Like if I tell you now escribir, escribir with IR on the end is the verb to write. You could then say, okay, I know how to say I write, you write, he writes, we write, they write. I can say it all because I just take off that IR. That leaves me, so I go from escribir to escrib, and then I put O, escribo, I write, es, escribes, you write, escribe, escribimos, escribís, escriben. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. Muchísimas gracias por ver este video. Thank you very much for watching this video. Some next steps you might want to take are to practice chanting these endings. So, O, as, a, amos, ais, an. O, es, e, hemos, es, en. O, es, e, imos, is, en. You can also practice writing them out because that's a really good way. You could do it while you're chanting as well. O, write down O, as, write down as, and keep going. Because that's a really good way not just to memorize the sounds, which are going to help you with your speaking, but to memorize the letters, which will help you with your writing and recognizing when you're reading as well. And you could also practice conjugating the key verbs we looked at today. So taking those infinitives and putting them into their 6 forms, using that structure that we looked at and those endings that we looked at. And if you want to push it even further, you could type into Google regular Spanish verbs, and then you could take a verb with an AR, an ER, or an IR ending, and then practice conjugating it. So take a verb that I haven't mentioned today, just make sure it's a regular one, because there are some irregular verbs that we'll look at in another video, and they can catch you out sometimes. Otra vez, muchísimas gracias por ver, y espero que te vaya muy bien con el español.